Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, or good whatever time you're watching this to my guys, gals, and non binary pals. I hope you're enjoying seeing me right now because I can't see you because I don't know when you're going to watch this. But I have something I'm excited to talk about tonight. And because it is night for me. Before I start, I always give the disclaimer. If you're going through something and you're thinking of a permanent solution to a temporary problem, I ask that you turn off this video and you dial 988, which is the mental health crisis hotline. You are important. You are needed. You are way more important than this video. And so always take care of yourself first. So, it's a presidential election year. And if you haven't already heard things like the most important election ever, or if so and so wins, there won't be another election, or it's going to be the dirtiest election ever, I'm curious what rock you've been hiding under, because they've just been, every time around, they say the same thing. I'm doing a 4-part series on 4 stolen elections, or at least in my research, 4 elections that I believe were stolen. But before, I want to define what stolen is not. I do not like the Electoral College method of electing the president, but that's the method. So if somebody won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, but there was no signs of fraud, that is not a stolen election under my definition. That's just a consequence of an outdated system. But until that law changes, which isn't happening anytime soon, that is going to be the way the president is elected. How I define a fraudulent election is where one party deserved to win, and due to dishonesty, malfeasance, and other words that sound like dishonesty, the person who should have won did not. And that's based on the Electoral College votes, not the popular vote, because that's not how we elect the president. I wish it was, but it's not. I believe this has happened 4 times in American history. The first time, I believe, was in 1824, when Andrew Jackson got more electoral votes and more popular votes, but somehow John Quincy Adams became president. In 1960, I believe that there was massive amounts of fraud in Illinois and Texas, and that Nixon should have actually won those states. And had he won those states, he would have had the amount of electoral votes needed to become the president. But those states went to Kennedy. And I believe there was dishonesty behind that. And surprisingly, the individual who comes off the most humble in the whole story is Richard Nixon, who could have done a lot of things and definitely had evidence to support the fact that the election might have been stolen from him. But for the sake of the country, he conceded. The next one was the first election I voted in, 2000, where I do believe that Al Gore was the rightful winner. But in Florida, it was so stacked against him because the eventual declared winner, George W. Bush, his brother was the governor, and it was just everyone who made a decision was a Bush person. And then the Supreme Court ultimately made a decision I very much disagreed with. But we're not going to be talking about those today. We're going to be talking about 2020. Just joking. Got ya. We're going to be talking about the 1876 election, which surprisingly I learned new things about today. I thought I knew it all about this election. I was wrong. It's actually more fascinating than I originally thought. Okay. You had, going into the election season, Ulysses Grant was the president. Now, Ulysses Grant was known as a very good general and an honorable man. Unfortunately, his administration was very corrupt and very dishonest, and really has given him somewhat of a reputation he doesn't deserve, because Ulysses Grant was a man of honor, but he surrounded himself with people who weren't. And Congress actually came out and gave an opinion vote, which I didn't even know was a thing. Like a vote just saying, this is what we think. Not like, how does a bill become a law? Just, this is our opinion, that the president should only serve 2 terms, which is what George Washington had suggested in his farewell address. But it wasn't law back then. It didn't become law until Eisenhower. So Grant could have very well run for a 3rd term, and I believe his original intentions were until this congressional vote. And he saw the writing on the wall because of all the just awful people he surrounded himself with. So we were going to get a new president. So let's talk about who the Republicans nominated and who the Democrats nominated. I don't feel the need to go into the primaries, so I'm just going to say who got the nominations and give some details about them. The Republicans chose Rutherford B. Hayes, who by all accounts was a very honorable man. He had fought in the Civil War, been injured, and went back to fight for the North. He was a Harvard graduate, and he never had a sip of alcohol his entire life. Although, I don't know if I trust people who have never had a drink. And this is from someone who doesn't drink anymore. But by all accounts, he was a family man, and he was a man of respect. And his platform was continue Reconstruction, that we're on a good path. We just need to get rid of the dirt surrounding the Grant administration. But he wanted to keep the course of integrating the country and actually saying all men are created equal, which is just something people were saying. The Democrats chose and Hayes was the governor of Ohio. The Democrats chose Samuel Tilden. Now, this was a very interesting choice. The Democrats at that point were known as like the anti-Reconstruction Party. But he kind of believed in Reconstruction. He was unmarried, fine. He was governor of New York, but the thing he's known for is the Democratic establishment was run by Boss Tweed at that point. And Tilden took down Boss Tweed and took down that entire Tammany Hall structure. And keep in mind, he was a Democrat. So while he was a Democrat, he didn't like go the corporate line on everything, if you would. Both of these men, by all accounts, were honorable men with good intentions. I don't know how often people can say that about presidential elections, but they seemed like good guys there for the right reason. Their campaigns, not so much. The Tilden campaign put out rumors that Hayes, in a drunken rampage, had shot his mother in the leg. Now keep in mind, Hayes never drank, and his mother had died quite a few years previously, so she couldn't just come out and say, that's nonsense. The Hayes campaign connected Tilden to the Lincoln assassination, of which there is no evidence of. And I actually looked pretty hard to see if there was any truth to that. I couldn't find any. If you can find some, comments, please. But, so you had these two good guys who were running pretty dirty campaigns. And this was like really the first time where you had political cartoons. Not the first time, but where they became really prevalent. So it comes to election night. Tuesday, November 7th, 1876, where it was looking really good for Tilden. He was just cleaning up that night. There was an 81% voter turnout. To this day, that is still the highest voter turnout of eligible voters at the time of any presidential election. Obviously, who's been defined as an eligible voter has changed, but 81%. And in order to win the election, the candidate needed 185 electoral votes because we had less states than we do now. So, by the end of the evening, every state seemed to have been called, with the exception of 3, and it looked like Hayes, 166, Tilden, 184, one shy of having enough electoral votes to become the president-elect. Hayes told the media that night that he was of the opinion that the Democrats had carried the country and elected Tilden. Formal concession speeches didn't become a thing until William Jennings Bryan and Theodore Roosevelt, but it was as close as you got at the time. And he went to bed. He was a humble man. He just believed he lost. And he was like, okay. His campaign manager, though, went to bed with a handle of vodka. Until they realized that 184 and 185 are not the same number. Thus, Tilden was one short still. And there were 3 states that hadn't called the election yet. And these 3 states were South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Doesn't it seem like Florida's just always involved when there's a election problem? So, but they seem to be going the Tilden direction. So, nothing was formally declared. So President Grant determined that he wanted to see if there was voter intimidation and fraud. Now keep in mind, President Grant was a lame duck he was leaving the office. Now, back then, the president and vice president were inaugurated on March 4th. It's currently January 20th. Laws have changed. So Grant also put federal soldiers at the capitals of those 3 states because violence was started breaking out. And I'm not here to talk about any accusations of voter fraud in recent elections, but in this one, there's no question that there was. In South Carolina, there were 150 examples of black voters being murdered before they entered the voting booth. In Louisiana, there was just such voter intimidation. While I couldn't find evidence of anyone actually being physically harmed, the fear was instilled into them. And in Florida, the Democrats actually put a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the ballot because you need to remember that this was the first time a lot of people were voting and they couldn't all read. So the Democrats saw this as an opportunity to mislead them because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. But if you have 2 ballots and you see Lincoln on one of them, you're going to assume that's a Republican ballot if you don't have the ability to read. It was a mess. There were shots at Rutherford B. Hayes' home, and no one knew what to do. The Electoral College ended up meeting, as they are constitutionally required to, and slates of electors, Does that sound familiar? Were put in for both Tilden and Hayes in those three states. So constitutionally, what should have happened is the president should have been determined by the House of Representatives in this weird way in that they only do this for in this very specific situation where they can't get an electoral winner, where each state gets one vote. So if, let's say, Maine has 5 House members, 3 Republican, 2 Democrat, it's going to go to the Republican. And that's the only time they ever vote that way. And I don't believe it's ever happened, but it's in the Constitution. The Senate then would elect the vice president, which made you run the risk of a divided government. And maybe that would be a good thing. Is that what happened? No. No, it's not. President Grant went to Congress and they wrote up the Electoral Commission Act of 1877. This was where you would have a body that consisted of 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans and 1 independent. The Republicans and Democrats would be coming from Congress, respectively, and 1 independent who would be a Supreme Court justice, as you would assume would be the deciding vote, but the congressmen are not tied to voting based on their party, although you would expect them to. And who was chosen was independent Justice David Davis, who was known for just calling balls and strikes. He was a very difficult man to read. And no one really knew how he was going to vote. Keep in mind, at this point, the country is on the brink of civil war again. Truly. So Davis, what did he do? He picked up his ball and he went home. He didn't want to be the guy who decided this. So he ran for the Illinois State Legislature, or he was appointed, I believe. And he excused himself and resigned from the Supreme Court and said, history, whatever happens here will not be my responsibility. So there was a seat that had to be filled. And it was filled by Justice Joseph P. Bradley, who was a Republican. Now the Republicans had a 1-seat majority on this commission that you could pretty easily argue was unconstitutional, because the Constitution had a method that wasn't being followed. However, they met every day, hours and hours and hours, and it wasn't televised because there was no TV. And people really didn't know what was going to happen. The Democrats hit the streets chanting Tilden or blood. Hayes kept very quiet because he was a very humble man. Now, what ultimately happened was is one of the biggest stains on American history. As I said earlier, the president would be inaugurated on March the 4th. On March the 2nd, they still didn't know who was going to be declared the winner of the election. So the Electoral Commission met at the Wormley Hotel, whose owner was the richest black man in America at the time, David Wormley, where this agreement was reached. The election would be handed to Hayes, who ran on a platform of Reconstruction and integrating society. But he had to pull the troops, the Northern troops, out of the South. Because up until that point, there were still Northern troops in the South to just try to keep the peace, which obviously they didn't do a very good job in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, but that's a story for another day. Reconstruction was going along pretty well from let's say the end of the Andrew Johnson administration to that time. Ulysses Grant was a good president when it came to Reconstruction. When it came to other things, not so much. So, if they were hand hazed the election, he would have to take away the protection that the newly free slaves had. But the Democrats compromised too. Their compromise was, we won't do anything bad. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, don't worry. We'll still, integrate. It'd be good. And the next day, in a private ceremony, Rutherford B. Hayes was inaugurated as president in the White House by Ulysses Grant. They did have a public inauguration, but they didn't have all of the party that goes with it. There was no inaugural ball. There was no parade. There was just Capitol, sworn in, to the White House he went. And he made good on his promise, unfortunately. And that was the end of Reconstruction. Now, I used to think that this led to the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. It's not, but it empowered them. Because before the compromise, I even hate calling it, but the compromise of 1877, the Klan wasn't really anything. They became a big deal once the troops were removed. And the protections, they were all gone. And the Democrats didn't keep their promise and behave. And this is really the reputation that Rutherford B. Hayes has. This is his legacy, which is unfortunate because it is not what his belief structure was. It's actually quite the opposite. He ran on a promise of only serving one term, and he honored that. He was an honorable man who sold his soul to the devil. Another interesting fact about the 1876 election, it's the only election ever and this still holds, where somebody won more than 50% of the popular vote and didn't win the election. What does that really mean in the grand scheme of things? Nothing, but I found it interesting. I'll always wonder how history would have been different if Hayes were to have run the administration he wanted to, and if he was able to serve the way that he wanted to and believed, because he didn't. He was a president who went against all of his beliefs to become president. Samuel Tilden pretty much kind of fell into obscurity after that. And that's the story of the election of 1876, which I believe was stolen. However, if everyone was able to vote freely, Hayes probably would have won. But with the voter intimidation, Tilden probably won. Will we ever know the actual truth? No. So this is episode 1 of a stolen election. So you have to look forward to 1824, 1960, and 2000. And my project about talking about racism in society, don't forget about that. I will actually be interviewing my father on Sunday. It should be really interesting. And I think tomorrow I'm going to be talking about one of the other 3 presidential races. So that's all the news that's fit to print. I love you. And I hope you've enjoyed seeing me. And hopefully you've learned something. I know I learned a lot just in researching this. And I really thought I knew it. I was completely educated on this. But this led to Jim Crow. There probably would not have been Jim Crow laws if it weren't for the Compromise of 1877. It put our country back so much. And it's a shame. We could be in a better place. But we're not. And we have to live in the society in which we do. So I need to go to bed because I have a job. And I look forward to making another one tomorrow. Any questions or comments, leave them down there. Like and subscribe. I don't have the graphics, so I pretend I do. And I love you. Bye.